Alrighty. This is going to be a little bit chaos because I wrote most of it last night and the rest of it while I was sitting there, and I can't even remember what I put in it. So let's talk a little bit about the magic of framework. And let's see if this will work. Hey, there we go. So first up, let's just talk about what is framework magic. It tends to be stuff which is code where you are code hidden behind convention. So this is something from Laravel. It's a bit old now, but you could name a function in a model, get whatever you want attribute, and it would make available whatever you returned as a property of the class named as the state case version of that. I always found that a bit ugly, but this is part of the magic of a framework. Hiding slightly more complex code through some conventions. It's abstractions masking complexity. So this is a slightly cleaned up piece of code that came from, I think it was Go with PHP, which is from Nuno, who works for PHP, who made this website going, hey, look how great PHP is. And he put in this little chunk of code to say, you can do a lot with just a tiny little bit of code, and that's what it is. It's masking a lot of complexity. So in that one little chunk of code, it is pulling out the currently logged in user, attaching a new order to them. It's validating the request with a form request. It's doing a whole bunch of stuff and then returning the order. And it all just kind of magic. And it's something that makes people really mad. So this one has been popping up around a little bit, and I found it hilarious. I'm not a great fan of Taylor, but I thought that was kind of funny. All right, so let's talk about some of the magic that you'll find in frameworks. First one is dependency injection. This is not particularly controversial. Most people think dependency injection is a good idea. It helps to solve a few problems. We've got include soup. We can get rid of a lot of the include soup that happens in a lot of files. A lot of that comes from auto loading, and now we replace it with use soup, but we still get rid of a lot of we still get rid of a lot of soup at the start of a file. We can make our classes independent from their dependencies. So here's an example of a chunk of code that I'll probably be reusing a bunch of times through here, where we need to make a payment. And the old school way was, well, you'd have to new up the payment gateway and then new up the client for that. And then you have this in a whole bunch of different places. So this capture payment is now silently, without you being aware, dependent on the gateway config and the gateway payment client. And you can't really see it easily from outside of there, and you can't see all of the places, or it'll be difficult to tell all the ways that it's being used and switch to a different payment gateway like Stripe or whatever else. It helps you write some drier and more solid code. So this is just a search across an older code base that is not using much dependency injection, and it is newing up a user in 47 places across 29 files, and most of those are just to get the currently logged in user, because of there's no way to inject that into the application outside of doing this new user get from session. And it provides a lot of easier testing. So I can't even remember why I wrote these. Yeah, so basically, just trying to remember what I was. Oh yeah, the making comments here. If you're not using dependency injection, it's difficult to inject, say, a part of a request into your test in a sane manner, especially if your test is just directly accessing the post superglobal. So you'd have a comment like, don't move this under the other test, because if you want to test without something in that super global, then that test will break suddenly because it's being set in another test later on. So it's the tests are no longer independent from each other. So there's a few different ways to do dependency injection. Easy way is you use factory methods where you have these kind of singleton factories which are responsible for getting the thing, and they will hold a static reference to it. It's kind of old school. It's kind of useful, but if you're using proper static methods, you can accidentally override a static variable and then all of your application crashes down. And you can do constructor injection. So when you are newing up a class, it requires particular things to be passed through. So that way, in testing, you can new it up by passing through different things that are more testable. And then when you get to more modern frameworks, you'll get service containers and reflection. So this is not any particular framework, but it's the type of thing that you'd see in Laravel, where you just have a function and you say, this function accepts a payment gateway, and you never have to pass it to that. The framework does it for you. Magic. So let's have a quick look about how reflection injection works. Step one, you call everything through the service container. So instead of calling gateways payment gateway instance and then passing it into the method, you can just call the method directly through the service container. So you're no longer touching the order controller object. You're just saying, hey, service container, I want you to call the capture method on the order controller class. What it does internally, and this is not a complete chunk of what Laravel does, but it's the rough concept. It uses Nathan's favorite reflection to look at the class, look at the objects, look at the method that you're calling, and figure out what are the types that this wants. And if it's a type that's not built in and we can build it, we'll just build those and then call the method afterwards after we have built up all of the types out of the service container. So in this case, it would have discovered it requires a payment gateway class. So it'll build one up and call it gateway and pass it through, and it'll require an order class and it'll build it up and pass it through. And the amount is a base type, so it just kind of does nothing with it. If there's a default value, it passes through the default value. So this is real low, basic. In the proper frameworks, there's a lot of extra bullshit to deal with, union types and all sorts of weird edge cases and all sorts of bits and pieces there. And then you resolve this from the service container. So you tell the service container, hey, when someone asks for a payment gateway class, here's how you provide it. And that's where you do your new up. So all your newing up is done in one place, and that can be accessed from everywhere through the system, and it's always accessing the one method, and you don't have to write it 100 times. It can just go, they want a payment gateway. I know how to get a payment gateway. You call this function, and it gives you back a payment gateway. So yeah, you call this class, and you call the method, and you get the resolved payment gateway from the container. You get the order from the container. If you pass anything through for the amount, it'll forward that on as well. And now you can test. So you can tell the app container, hey, instead of giving back your regular new payment gateway, give back this fake one, which is a mock. So we're not actually making API calls to payment gateways. Like in my first job, where I spent a day testing and realized I was hitting a live payment gateway repeatedly on a recurring payments cron all the day. Yeah, so that was fun. Trial by fire. So yeah, now you can inject, there's the word, there's the dependency injection. You can inject your dependencies in a way that is more testable. So you can just call the order controller and it will now get this fake gateway instead of the real payment gateway. And then you can use assertions from your mocked out methods, right. So it's pretty helpful. So let's get into some more controversial. Laravel facades. Laravel gets a lot of flack for being magic, and there's a lot of magic, and the biggest offender of the magic is facades. I don't know exactly why, but people hate facades, which is probably why good old Trolley Taylor got his number plate. No matter, he posted another thing a few days later going, "Nah, really, it's just a reminder that life is fragile, and that's what it really is. And all life is a facade, and that's what it really means." No, you was just trying to troll. You're trying to troll people because you know people really hate facades. So, what even is a facade? It looks like a static class. So you just kind of access it and call static methods. But when you go and look at the payments, it's got no method. So none of those methods that you're calling exist. And it's available globally. So that class, you can just use payments, and you've got this payments facade, which is actually app support facades payments, which also has no methods in it. And it just, the only thing it has in it is says something about return payments. I don't know. Yep. Good fucking code. So this is roughly how it works. You have a facade, you call it, you give it the name, whatever name you want, you extend the facade, and that says you have to give it a facade accessor, which is a string. Then you have a look around and you find that that string is bound to the payment gateway class. So dependency injection doesn't have to work off class names. It does because it's convenient, but it's just strings. So you can say, hey, when anyone asks for a string of payments, give me a payment gateway. And then it goes, hey, what's a payment gateway? I know how to make one of those, and then it uses it up. It's dependency injection all the way down. So this is the reason why I don't quite get why people are frustrated with facades. Because it's not really magic. At least it's not the magic they seem to think it is. Wrapper and having 50 for checks them later on when you need them and only when you need them. And that's all a facade is effectively. But it does make testing easier because you can inject in your test without affecting any of your other tests and say, hey, this facade should be called. This method on this facade should be called. This is how many times it should be called. And when it's called, this is what you should get back. If it does, that's test value. That's a failed assertion. You have failed to call the payments gateway once with capture on the payment facade once. And when you did call it, you got back this new payment with an amount. You can also just inspect the action. So if you don't want to swap out what it does, but you still want to know that it did the things, you can just use a cache, you can use the spy command on a facade. And all that does is just goes, okay, for the rest of this test, I'm just going to keep track of what was called. So you can ask me later if these things were called. Outside of that, it's not doing anything particularly magic. It's just dependency injection with a couple of arrays to track whether things happened or not. And if you really care about PHPStan and SAM, type hinting in a way that it and PHPStorm and everything else understand is super easy. It's one line. You just tell it what service it's wrapping around. They all work perfectly fine. They convert all of the instance methods to static methods, and it is aware of how they all work, and it's fine. It's not a big deal. You can get all your static analysis. You can know that when you're passing the wrong thing and what it'll return from all of those methods. It's fine. It's not a big deal. So the other bit of magic that people love to hate is Eloquent. Eloquent is part ORM, part query builder. It's a kind of jack of all trades for database access. So you can define models, you can tell it what's accessible on the models, but it just it's active record. You just kind of tell it to do stuff and it'll write up the queries and do it. If you have complex things, you can add joins on your queries, you can pull in relations, you can do anything that you can do in SQL, you can through outputs, you can inspect and see that it's done the right database for the most part gets to sometime. But it has a queries. This is a cut down version of one that I've done to you. All it does is when deleted that. That's all it does. So it'll be appended, and then you have to say, no, I don't want it to work that way. I want to get include delete. For public, call post all, and you would get only the published posts, because the apply where not null published at is tapped on or and it runs with drafts will take the scope off and then apply the inverse. So it will give you null publish at. Eloquent also has model observers. So these are pretty helpful things. Models fire events. So when you are creating, when it has been created, when you're deleting, saving, updating, all of these things, they're all events, and you can just add an observer and go, hey, whenever we are creating a slide, for example, here, before you save it, just run this bit of code, and then in here we inject the last sequence so we've got automatic ordering that is not unique across the whole table, but unique compared to a relation. Or you can do it with slugifying content. And there's a whole bunch of things. You could also return a false from this and go, hey, I don't want to actually do this create because you've passed me some junk, so I'm going to prevent this save operation from happening. And all of the model events can be fired, and you can hook into all of them, and you can add in your own as well if you really want to.
I think the screen share with Google Meet stopped for some reason, just before.
Alrighty.
Might be the internet.
It is possible.
But it's still on. I think it's just like maybe kicked off video.
Share screen.
Yeah, some of people were saying that your audio keeps chopping out, maybe?
Probably because I'm walking around a bunch. All right, are we good again? Is that all?
You're sharing again.
Yep.
All right, so we also get relationships. So if you have a model which is related to another model or to multiple other models, those available, make those options many of the assessments, and it will resolve. When you ask for assessments, it'll run that query and get you all the assessments attached to this model. You think a lot of them that's so when you're pulling them out, you can go, hey, I also want you to load the at the same time. There we go. Right, guys? Well, the internet's technically run off my phone. So there we go. All right. So we were at, yeah, so you can tell it load early. So if you're getting all of the assessments, you can tell it to also load these relations, and it does it much more efficiently, where it gets all your assessments and then runs a query for all of the users that are attached to any of the IDs that came back in your assessment query. So it'll run 3 queries instead of 400. You can also do load missing, where it's a kind of, if you've already got the relation, you don't need to run this query, but if you don't, we can run it now. And you can also query them using the method to grab the actual relationship. So you can go, hey, I want the assessments just where there's no user ID.
So you have some and mixins and all that working with relationships.
Yep. Yeah, so
How did you do that?
Laravel IDE helper has a utility called models, where it will
writes out the.
It will not only write out the model, it will inspect your database and figure out what columns actually exist and write out your full block. It'll write out, and it's very configurable as well, but it'll write out all your helper methods that you need to use for query builder stuff. So you're with trash, you're with published, it'll figure out all of that type of stuff, all of those relations too. So yeah, it basically writes a doc block which PHPStan and Sam and PHPStorm and all of those can recognize and deal with, and it's pretty nice. And very quick to do. And if you really don't want anyone to be able to do lazy loading, so you don't want anyone to be able to do N+1 queries, they added this nice little one here. This should be strict, where it will throw an exception if you attempt to lazy load something or access a property which the model doesn't have. And you typically just run that in non-production environments, so it'll blow up on dev and staging, but not in production. But yeah, there's a very simple thing where you call model should be strict, and all that does is injects in some model observers and goes, hey, you're trying to eager load a relation and you said I shouldn't, so here's an exception instead. It makes it a lot easier to get away with not having N+1 queries everywhere. So it's not magic, it's just kind of hacky code. That's pretty much the summary. A lot of framework magic looks like magic until you understand it, and I have been doing a heck a lot of source diving, and I've understand quite a bit of how Laravel and Symfony and Livewire and Vue and React, and I've been doing a lot of digging lately.
You'll break in on the Genset.
No. I still have some self-worth left. A little bit. No, I have actually touched a relatively recent Magento product, and that was, no. I dumped the client and left. Although, to be fair, they were trying to build a Docker container like a VM, and it had an 8-minute boot time. Yeah. So yeah, any questions? There's a lot of jankiness behind the scenes. There's some weird jankiness in relationships, which I've harped on about before. at some point in the code base on a particular type of relationship where it's trying to guess the name of the relationship, it does a debug backtrace and gets the third function back and says, that's my relationship name if you didn't set it. So there's a little weird jankiness, but if it's hidden in the framework, it's just kind of hidden there and you don't have to look at it. So, any questions?
It's a real-time facade.
That one is actually rubbish. So for anyone who's not aware, a real-time facade is you just never use it, but it's a namespace called facade where you can access any kind of class you want and claim that it's inside the facade namespace, and it will new up a facade for accessing that class. More or less, it's terrible. There are a few things with facades that you should avoid. I personally avoid using the global injected methods. There's an aliases config inside the application config where it sets up all of the aliases for facades. And if you particularly hate them, you can just go and remove that. And then it won't put in any aliases, and you can only access the facade from the actual path to the facade. Makes it a little bit easier to figure out where things are coming from. So there's a few holding it right around Laravel. And I didn't dig too far into Symfony, but there is a couple of projects I've worked on recently where you have functional code in DocBox, and that is just the worst concept ever. And I know attributes didn't exist, but still functional DocBox is just terrible.
Go have a look at like property accessor and the normalizer components and stuff. And there's a special type of hell in there as well. That's my life right.
Thank you for the warning. Yeah. So yeah, anyone else? Anything else? Or is that just you still all hate Laravel?
Have you been doing a lot of Laravel lately?
Yeah, and I've been doing a lot of LiveWire lately and digging into how all of that works, and
I think
then
Laravel's magic.
oh yes, we won't get into that. The shit I've had to pull to get things to
The
get
new,
LiveWire to work sometimes.
the new magic I've been coming across is people actually bypassing the facades and creating actions, single invocable classes, and using app to pull the action straight into the method.
Yeah, that's completely fine. That's just dependency injection by another process.
Yeah, they're using the app helper.
There's also a bunch of helper functions which are bare global functions. So instead of calling the auth facade, you can just call a function called auth, which wraps the auth facade. And internally, it is still hitting the facade, so all your testing still works. It just looks a little bit cleaner than having static access everywhere. You just have these random functions which may or may not do something that you want it to.
We use that a lot, and request as well.
Yeah, no, I use requests, I use session, and I use auth a fair bit.
Yeah.
And string. String is also very helpful.
String.
Yeah. The short str instead of the string colon. Yeah.
There's like the attribute stuff and the model observers are particularly handy when I've had really big blobs of data that used to get stored in the database.
Yep.
And then I could slowly move it out to S3. And from anyone who's consuming the model, it just works the same way it did before.
Yep.
But you know, you rate your save, you write to that property, you hit save, and it all goes in. And when you pull it out, it just reads S3 for that particular property when you try and access it.
Yeah.
So it's quite handy for that. They don't always fire though, which is
So-
pretty shit.
They
You do a
will.
bulk insert or anything like that.
So bulk inserts are bypassing model events in fullness. So whatever words are, yeah, they're bypassing the model entirely, more or less. It's
It's basically doing DB insert instead of
Yeah.
model new.
Yeah. So they're not a foolproof way to ensure you have data integrity, but they between scopes and model observers, there is a lot of useful stuff in there that is it can make your life a lot easier without having to run through the same 8 functions or can abstract everything into service classes. And then occasionally you do find a junior who will do something like write this thing has been logged database query and then put it on the loaded event on a model. So anytime it's loaded for a view or for a list or not even shown to the user at all, it will fire an event and put in a database log. So there is ways to really go a cropper, but for the most part, it's pretty helpful.
And we use scopes for search restrictions too, which is fucking awesome.
Tenancy
Yeah.
stuff.
Yes,
Something
amazing. Yeah.
Scopes are great. I use the, what is it called? I just had it referenced there a little while ago, but where is it? The macros. The macros are the bane of my existence. They're macroable is a thing where you can inject methods into a class at a later point in time. At runtime, yeah. So right here we have injected a with drafts method into the query builder and an only drafts method into the query builder at runtime. So that exists in the query builder now. You can call it, but only on models that use this scope.
Wow.
We have a comment from Ming saying, FYI, dealing with a lot of data, when you're dealing with a lot of data, using Eloquent is a lot slower than just writing a little query.
Particularly relationships.
Yeah, big
Definitely.
relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are a couple of methods which make life a lot easier. You can just set a relation. So you can pull your couple of things out separately in small queries and then just set the relations. And that works just as well. So it's not running big queries. There's also a few, I can't pronounce his name, but someone who's built a few query builder or Eloquent extensions for things like adjacency and stuff like that, where it's using the common table expressions. So you can, in a single query, pull out a tree of relations, and it's actually quite efficient and very fast because it's doing a recursive SQL query in a single query to pull out all of these nested relations and their depths and all sorts of things like that. So I've been using that a little bit recently for nested categories. So yeah, the main thing about Laravel is if you don't like how something works, almost everything can be just swapped out to doing something the way you want it to. There are a very few exceptions where you can't replicate core functionality, and I hate it because I want to make my interfaces that look nice and pretty like the ones that come with the framework, but most people will never run into them. I run into them because I'm an idiot who is obsessed with doing stupid things to try and make it easy for other people to not have to know that it's doing something janky. That's pretty much what most frameworks are, is they're just there to hide the jank.
It's that Shia LaBeouf gif I've always loved.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. That was a great topic.